In this module, we're going to look at Module D. We're going to look at why we forget. What are some of the issues that cause us to forget? How can we minimize them? What kinds of things are we most likely to remember based on either cultural beliefs or importance to us and so forth? You'll note in your textbook that this actually comes towards the end of the chapter, but I want to I'm sort of skipping around and come back to biological in the last unit that I will be recording. So, why do we forget in the first place? What happens to our memories, those things that, we stored them, we thought they were important, we thought that it was interesting or something that we would need in the future for future reference, but comes the time we need it, we've forgotten it. And part of the problem is that we encoded it improperly. We didn't encode that information in a way that we can then retrieve it when we need it. And encoding is something that happens without our conscious knowledge. It's not something that we sort of sit down and say, okay, well, I want this to go to my amygdala and this to go to my hippocampus and this to go to somewhere else. That doesn't happen, obviously. But what does happen is that we try to form a connection when we encode some information. So we're learning some new information and we say, how does this relate to something that I've learned before? How can I make sure that I code it properly so that I will be able to retrieve it? And when we consciously do that, we are more likely to remember. But we often don't consciously do that. We try to passively read a textbook, for instance, where we just sort of read through it, maybe highlight here and there, but not really try and understand and apply it to our own life. This is why I like to give examples, because then I can sort of help you to make some connections between what we're talking about and how it relates to your life, how it relates to your, in this case, memory. The other issue, of course, is that sometimes if you don't use something, you lose it. We call this decay theory. And think about this if you've ever learned a second language. Well, and in fact, most of us have had the opportunity to learn French. It's required learning in elementary school and in high school. You can choose to continue with your French. You don't have to beyond a certain point, but you can. How many of you, if you were put in France right now, could be able to speak clearly enough to get your message across? Well, some of you probably feel like you could, and some of you feel like it might be a stretch, and others say, oh, no way, it's been too long since I learned French. And that's decay theory. If you've learned the French, but you're not using it on a regular basis, so you forget a lot of what you learn. The other thing that causes us to forget things is interference. And this, again, I'll use a language example to help you understand this. There's two types of interference. There's proactive and retroactive. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you sort of in a little bit more detail what we mean by these two concepts. But proactive is learning one thing and forgetting the other thing. And retroactive is forgetting the new thing because you're so ingrained with the old thing. Let me explain that a little bit more. Let's say you are taking sociology and psychology in the same semester, and some of you may be doing that. You like both subjects, but you find that they're very similar to each other. So your class, if it's retroactive learning, your first class is psychology and your second class is sociology. So you're more likely to recall the psychology than you are the sociology because you've learned that first. In proactive learning, it's the other way around. So you learn what you're learning more recently is what you remember when it comes time to recall it in, for example, a test. There's another example for this. I sometimes have when I get a new car, I've had a problem when I go into the mall because I'm thinking, I'm coming out of the mall and I'm thinking I'm looking for my little purple Toyota and thinking, where is it? Where is it? And then I remember all of a sudden, no, I have a new car. I've had that ingrained, that purple Toyota, because I drove it till it was in the ground, so to speak. Um, and that was stuck more in my mind than this shiny new Toyota Matrix that I just bought. Well, now it's not so new. I've had it a couple of years. I've always been a Toyota person. Anyway, so here's what's happening is that because it becomes so ingrained that in terms of the retroactive, the the thing that becomes so ingrained is the thing that you recall rather than the thing that you just got or just were exposed to. In the case of proactive, it's the other way around. Are there other reasons why we forget things? Absolutely. Sometimes we haven't consolidated the information properly. Most of the time, this is an automatic occurrence that would consolidate a new memory with our old memories. But if you had a traumatic experience, for instance, if you were in a motor vehicle accident and suffered a head injury and had a concussion as a result, you may have difficulty consolidating the memory. If any of you have ever talked to a person who's had a serious motor vehicle accident, they are not likely, and where they were unconscious for a period of time after the accident, they would not likely be able to remember it because of the different ways that it's stored. They would not remember the events immediately prior to the accident. Maybe that's a good thing because, if it's such a traumatic thing that, for instance, my brother was in a motor vehicle accident where he was thrown from the back of a pickup truck against a concrete wall. If he had remembered that detail of the moment of impact, it may be very traumatic on him. He has no recollection of it. We just pieced it together from people who were at the scene at the time and who tried to help my brother and the other passengers in the vehicle. The driver was not harmed. He sort of briefly got blacked out, but he was able to walk away from the whole thing. Okay. The other reason we forget, we talked a little bit about this in the last unit, and that is the motivated forgetting. So, for instance, we have a terrible experience in our childhood. If we put this at the unconscious level, it may have been that we were had some kind of experience that we feel shame for, that we feel angry and so forth, and so we don't know enough about that. We're not able to retrieve it except for maybe under hypnosis, and even then, is it always accurate? Amnesia is a very different situation altogether, and it's usually, again, as a result of some kind of head trauma, where a person is forgetting everything that happened during an event. They may have amnesia for a very short period of time, for like a couple of hours, or it may be a couple of weeks. And we're going to talk again a little bit more about this later on in the semester when we talk about psychological disorders. And we'll talk about some details related to amnesia that that you need to that are relevant to this particular unit. But for now, you just have to know that one of the ways that we sometimes forget things is because we have had a trauma, head trauma, that has maybe caused us to have that amnesia, or witnessing a traumatic experience. And an example of this, people who were witnesses to the twin towers in New York, who were walking around the streets after it happened, who didn't know their name, didn't know where they belonged, didn't know much about what had happened, how they got there, how they got down the stairs from their office to the street. So it was taking a lot of effort and a lot of time for people who were helping these victims from the Twin Tower buildings. The third reason we sometimes forget is we have difficulty retrieving something. And this, you may have had this happen to you, where you have um, been out with a person, with a friend, and you meet somebody, and you just can't come up with their name. It's on the tip of your tongue. You just sort of, you kind of think you know it, but you're not positive 100%. And part of that might be that they're out of context. So for instance, you know them from school and here you are in a mall. So you're in a different place and they're in a different place and they seem like a different person. But part of it may also be that you just can't find the right name or word or phrase to talk about this particular thing, whatever it may be that you're talking about. So we forget sometimes because we're not able to retrieve that memory as well. Sometimes we have retrieval failure, as I mentioned in the last slide, but we also have prospective forgetting. And this is where we forget to do something that we had intended to do. So for instance, I use the picture of the person with a string around their finger because it's sort of a classic symbol of, you know, I have to remember this. I have to remember to pick up my laundry at the dry cleaners after work today or after school, or I have to remember to go in, get my new license and registration because it's going to expire soon, or whatever the case may be. So you get home and you think, why do I have this string on my finger? And then you can't remember what it is you were supposed to remember. We call this prospective forgetting because you forgot to do something that you had the perspective or the thought of doing, or it was something you wanted to do in the future, although now is the future, and then you've forgotten from the time you left the house, let's say. The other thing that we know about memory is that it is very culturally specific. So for instance, memories exist within this cultural context where we see something as important to our cultural belief systems, and so we remember it. And an interesting study was done with people who were farmers in Africa and people who lived in the city. And they asked them about cows. The farmers were able to answer the questions no problem because for them, their cows are their livelihood. Whereas the city folks were not able to because that wasn't as culturally important to them. So we tend to remember not just the cultural context, but what is important and what we need or want in our life. For instance, you have a favorite song that you can remember word for word. Other people might not like that song the same way you do, and they might not remember the words as well. So it's about what is important to you, what you see as interesting. You're more likely to remember details, specific details, as opposed to someone who is not involved so deeply with that particular thing. Okay, so so far we've been talking about memory and how it works. I want to talk about what happens when it's not working as well in the next unit, which is on the brain and memory. But I also want to talk about how we can improve our memory. What can we do to have better ability to remember the things that are important or that have become important in our life for us? Okay.